What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the number one type of jig that you need to have tied on this time of year, no matter where you're at in the country, to go out and to catch some really big bass, as well as just go out and have a ton of fun catching a bunch of bass as well. Now, let me tell you a little story before we get into this video and we start breaking down the jig that we're going to talk about in today's video. So last week I was in the great state of New York, up in northern New York, fishing some of the Finger Lakes and other glacier style lakes up there. And me and my buddy, Mr. Bailey Ogbret from Be The Fish, caught some absolute magnum bass. Now, all the bass that we were focusing on last week were pre-spawn and spawners. And so all the fish that I caught were still in that pre-spawn and spawning stage, just like most of you guys still are up in the north. You know, some of you guys are just now getting into your fishing seasons because you've got closed bass seasons until a certain time of year. And some of you guys are just now starting to get warm enough where these bass are starting to want to move up and they're starting to want to spawn. And so all the bass that I caught on this jig that we're going to talk about today were pre-spawn and spawners up there. Literally came back down to Tennessee, went out fishing the next day after I got home, picked up the exact rod, reel, line, and jig with the same exact trailer and went and fished the same exact type of areas that I did up in New York, and ended up catching a bunch of bass down here in Tennessee. And then I talked to a couple of my buddies that were down in Texas and as well as Florida, and they went out and were throwing jigs very similar to this, catching bass. And so this is a jig that no matter where you're at in the country, it's super effective this time of year just because of what you're targeting, how you're targeting it, and the bass and what they're doing. And that jig, without any further ado, is a skipping jig. So we're going to break down the skipping jig today. We're going to break down exactly what a skipping jig is, how you use a skipping jig, and what I look for in a skipping jig, and some of the areas that I focus on the most with a skipping jig, so that you guys can go out and you can apply these tips and hopefully catch a bunch of big bass, just like I did last week in New York and when I got home here in Tennessee. And so without further ado, let's get into this video. So what is a skipping jig? Well, a skipping jig is any jig that you skip. And realistically, any jig that you have, you can skip it fairly effectively. It's a little bit harder to skip a football head jig than it is maybe a skipping jig and a jig specifically made to skip. But it's one of those things that, you know, any jig can be a skipping jig, but I think there are some specific things that I look for in my skipping jig that help me to be way more effective with it. And because realistically, when it comes to bass fishing, a lot of the times, you know, the wrong bait in the right place will catch a bass, but the right bait presented the right way at the right angle will catch a bass almost every single time when it's fished in the right place. And so, you know, it's one of those things that, yes, any jig can be a skipping jig, but there is a right tool for every single job. And so the job of skipping and what I look for in a skipping jig is more specific than just general jigs. So let's start breaking it down. So what I look for in a skipping jig all starts with the head of the jig. So this is a Berkley skipping jig, and there's a bunch of different skipping jigs out on the market. But all of those jigs have one thing in common, and that is a wide, flat head. So as you guys can see here, the head on this jig is very thin, but then it's very wide. It's almost got a guitar pick shape to it. And the reason that you look for that is the same reason that you look for a nice flat rock when you're just picking up rocks and skipping them into the water. The more wide and flat that rock is, the easier that it's going to skip. If you pick up a big round stone and you try to skip it, you may be able to skip it if you're really good at skipping stones, but for the most part, it's just gonna poof, it's gonna hit the water and just go straight in. Where those wider, flatter rocks are gonna do a lot better job of staying on top of the water and skipping and, you know, doing that awesome little satisfying skip that we like to see across the top of the water. And so when I'm looking for a skipping jig, just like in this Berkley skipping jig, I'm looking for a jig with a nice, flat, wide head and something that's going to be able to skip really, really well. And that all comes from that head shape. The next thing that I'm looking for is a thick skirt. So on these Berkley skipping jigs, these are actually a double skirt. And so they take the same amount of material that they would on a normal flipping jig and they just double it and they put it on these skipping jigs. The reason that they do that is the more bulk that you have in that skirt, when it's skipping across the top of the water, just like with that stone, it's going to create almost a flat area to help that jig to skip even better. That double skirted material just creates just a more resistance against the top of the water, kind of helps to keep that jig up on top of the water and help to keep it skipping across. And so that's one thing. You don't always have to have that, but it's something that Berkley did with this specific jig that I really, really like, that helps it to skip really, really well. And if you look at a lot of guys that throw swim jigs and skipping jigs and flip a lot of jigs, oftentimes they'll tie their own skirt and they'll double tie, you know, 2 skirts together just to make it a little bit thicker. And that has a lot to do with the fact that it helps that bait to stay up on top of the water and to skip. Now, the third thing that I look for is going to be the right trailer. Now, there is a right trailer for skipping a jig, and the reason that I say that is because I'm looking for a trailer that doesn't have a ton of action in the appendages. The more and bigger appendages that you have on the back of that jig, the less ability you're going to have to skip it. Because just like with your rock scenario that we were talking about, if you find a nice flat rock, but then you attach like 2 floppy things to the back of it, it's going to create a lot more drag, and thus it's going to make it where that rock doesn't want to skip as well as it could without those things on there. And so what I have found is that when I'm looking for a trailer to put back on a skipping jig, I'm looking for something that doesn't have a ton of action. This is the new Berkley Stank Bug, as you guys can see, just those little bitty claws. There's not a big flange on there. There really isn't much that actually grabs water, and even when this jig falls, it's going to have a very subtle action. And so, you know, realistically, that trailer isn't going to have as much grab and drag when you're trying to skip this bait, but still have action that once it's in the water and it's falling, you've got something kicking in behind that jig, putting out a little bit of, you know, pressure out into the water, a little bit of vibration out in the water, and doing what it needs to do to get those bass to bite. Also, with this stink bug, as you guys can see, very flat on the bottom, just wide, flat trailer. Again, it's going to help in the aid of actually skipping that jig, because again, just like our rock scenario, I'm going to keep on saying that, you want to find the roundest, flattest rock that you possibly can to go out and to skip with, and it's no different with your jig. And so those 3 key things when I'm thinking about skipping a jig are what I look for, or what I try to at least add to a jig if I don't have a skipping specific jig. Because there have been times that I go to the lake, I realize that they're up under the boat docks, they're up under the, you know, the overhanging trees, they're up under some sort of cover that I need to skip a bait up under. And the thing is I don't have a skipping jig, but I know that if I've got a flipping jig with a flat trailer on the back and a good bulky skirt on it like this one has on it, then I'm going to be able to effectively flip that jig and get those bites that I'm looking for. But if I have my Rethers, obviously we're going to pick the skipping jig that's specifically designed for skipping, because it has all the features and all the things that I'm looking for to be able to skip it really, really well. Now, when it comes to skipping a jig, the number one place that I like to skip a jig is around boat docks. Bass use boat docks. They love boat docks for a lot of different reasons, but especially during the pre-spawn, the spawn, and the post-spawn. The reason that they like them so much during the pre-spawn and the spawn is because it creates a piece of cover and a piece of structure that really kind of has everything that a bass is looking for to feel safe. A lot of the times when bass spawn, they're going to want something over their head. The reason that they want that is just their want and their need to feel as if though they're not going to be able to be attacked. That self-preservation instinct that a bass has kicks in full bore when the spawn comes around, because bass have to move shallow. They have to get up in water where there's enough sunlight penetration for their eggs to be able to get enough sunlight to, you know, be fertilized well by the male, and then obviously thrive and turn into little baby bass. And so a lot of the times on a lot of different lakes, including clear finger lakes like we were on up north, or down here in the south when you got kind of greener, more phytoplankton filled water, or even down in south with the tannic water, that forces those bass up shallow. And so when those bass go up shallow and when they start to spawn, they want something over their head, whether that be a tree limb, whether it be a boat dock, whether it be a pontoon, something like that, that will keep a predator from above from attacking them. Because most bass in most of the lakes throughout the country are the apex predator in that environment. And so, you know, they don't have to worry about things, you know, coming in the water to eat them, unless, you know, you got muskies or seals or dolphins or something like that, which again, not very often that you see that. Those are very specific scenarios. All of their predators come from above. Eagles, cranes, storks, different types of water birds, ospreys, all of those different birds are going to come from above and going to attack them from above and going to try to kill them. And so bass look for things to get under. Now the boat dock is the perfect thing to get under because it never changes. It's always the way that it is, especially on natural lakes that don't have any water fluctuation. Once that dock is in the water, for the most part, that dock does not move. That dock does not get taken down. It doesn't go up. It doesn't go down. It stays in that place. And so the consistency of the cover that it provides for those bass, as well as, you know, structure and cover are two different words, but really the cover above their head, but also the structure of the dock itself, meaning that they can tuck right up next to a boat dock post, or tuck right up next to a cable, tuck right up next to some sort of concrete pillar, you know, a wooden pillar, whatever it is. There's a bunch of different things up under that boat dock. They can tuck right up next to it. They can make their bed next to it, and then they have that cover over the top of their head. And so it gives them a place to make their bed, to have their babies, and to feel safe the entire time that they're doing it. Now, when you go into the post-spawn, the reason that bass love docks so much is because, again, it provides cover for them. But two, after those babies have been born and after they've, you know, hatched out of their eggs, a lot of the time you'll have what are called fry garters. And what fry garters are male bass, sometimes female bass. I have caught female fry garters. I've seen both the male and the female on bed still when the fry are out, and they've both acted aggressive towards lures, and or I have caught them because they're very aggressive towards certain things. So I don't think it's always males. I think it can be a mix sometimes. But anyway, it's bass that are defending their babies. And so for a short period of time, right after bass are born and they hatch out of their eggs, there are going to be fry guarding bass that are actively defending their newborn babies. Now, there is a time period on into the post-spawn when they kind of just forget that they're babies. They'll cannibalize them, and so that is a thing. But for a short period of time, you'll have those fry guarders. And oftentimes, the bass are going to guard the fry in the exact area where they spawned those babies at. And again, liking those boat docks, again, knowing that most predators that are going to try to kill the adult bass are going to come from the sky, and allowing them to kind of stay in that area where they had those babies, they're going to use those boat docks, those boat dock posts, the structure of the boat dock, and just the overall, you know, existence of the boat dock, and as an area to live in and to defend in. And then eventually, once you get so far into the post spawn, most of those bass will just live there. A lot of bass don't leave boat docks. They don't leave shallow water. Those are what we call resident bass. And those resident bass will live under those boat docks all year long. They go winter under those boat docks. They are spawn under those boat docks. They go post-spawn under those boat docks. They feed up post-spawn under those boat docks. They live all fall under those boat docks, and that's just where they live. There's an entire population of bass around me that literally live in marinas under floating boat docks, and they are consistently there all year long. And again, one of the most effective ways to get in there to them is skipping something in there. Now, why do I choose the skipping jig to go and fish for those fish over, say, a wacky rig or a fluke or something like that? Well, I will choose the wacky rig and the fluke. I love both of those techniques for catching bass, especially up under docks. It is super effective in catching them. But what I've noticed is pre-spawn, spawn, and immediate post-spawn, the bigger the profile, the bigger the bite. Getting those big bass to eat first is what I want to do, because oftentimes when you pull up to a dock, especially pre-spawn and spawn, you're going to have multiple bass up under these docks. And oftentimes you'll have a couple of males, maybe one male to 4 males up under a dock, and then 1 or 2 big female bass up under there that all those males are trying to kind of court and get them to come use their bed and to spawn with them. And so oftentimes what I've found is that the big female bass will react a lot more violently to a bigger profile like a jig versus something like a wacky rig. I have seen so many times when I've thrown a wacky rig up under a dock and literally been able to visually see them with my eyes, that those smaller bass will lash out and grab it first. And those big females, there's just something about that small presence, that kind of dainty, more finesse presence that they just don't care about as much. Whereas when you skip the jig in there, something that's got a lot more bulk, a lot more presence, a lot more water displacement, it's just going to really get those fish's attention a lot more. They're a lot more aggressive to it. And I think it's just because bigger bass notice bigger things, and they probably think it's something like a bluegill or, you know, a shell cracker or a red eye or any of those little panfish species that get up there and that terrorize them during that spawning time. And they lash out at them and they eat them. And then especially if you're in the pre-spawn, a lot of bass are feeding up. And so if you're on a lake that has a ton of bluegill, this does a really good job of mimicking a bluegill and representing a bluegill. And it's just one of those things that oftentimes that time of year, if a bass is sitting on a dock and it's getting ready to spawn and it's feeding up, and you show them something that looks like a bluegill in the area that they're living, they're going to absolutely crush it, and they're going to eat it. Now, you know, we've broken down like what do I look for in the skipping jig, and then why am I skipping a jig, and what am I actually skipping a jig under. And so now I want to break down, you know, what I actually throw a skipping jig on. So a lot of people get real specific with jig skipping gear. You know, there are jig skipping specific rods out there that people have created. And, you know, I've used some of those jig rods and kind of used those specific to that job rod before. And what I've found is that, you know, I kind of go back to just my standard rod and standard rod reel and line that I would use almost for, you know, flipping and pitching and those kinds of things. And so the rod that I use is a 7/6 heavy fast action rod. This is just like your standard flipping stick, what most people would kind of associate with flipping a jig or dragging a jig, and like any other jig application, that's the rod that I use. I just feel comfortable with it. I'm also a really tall guy, so I'm 6'4", and so, you know, I feel comfortable with a little bit longer rod, whereas some people like my buddy Mr. Benjamin Nowak, he loves to skip with a shorter rod. He actually skips with a 6'10" heavy, and it's because Ben is about a foot shorter than I am, and so he's not a foot shorter. I think he's like 5'8", so he's, you know, he's a little bit shorter than I am. Maybe he's 5'6". He's kind of built like a hobbit. That doesn't matter. But anyway, so Ben's a shorter guy. Poor Ben catching strays over here. But Ben being a shorter guy uses a little bit shorter rod. And so, you know, I think the biggest thing to look for is not really the rod length, but the rod action. I really think that having a heavy, fast action rod is super important. And the reason that I say that is because you are skipping this bait up under a dock. And so just the action of skipping this thing up under a dock, that means that you're going to have a chance to wrap it around boat dock posts, cross beams, cables, ropes, anything else that might be up under that dock. I mean, just the other day when I was up in New York, I pulled a bass out from under a dock over a boat dock like cross beam that was metal made out of aluminum, and then over a float that was there, like it was like a sea-doo float. And so those three different things that I had to worry about getting those fish out from under, and really the power of that rod is what helps you to get those fish out of there. And the reason that we use like a heavy fast action, because a lot of people you'll see on the internet that they're like, oh, why do we even use gear that heavy for saltwater fish? Well, that's because in saltwater, for the most part, you have sand bottom. And so if you like hook a tuna 25 foot off the bottom, all you have to really worry about is getting it past the sharks and getting it into the boat. Whereas with bass fishermen, like I just described, that area where that fish is living, there's so many obstacles that we have to get them past. And how we get them past that is the power of our rods. And so when we hit those fish, really what you want to try to do is hit that fish and turn its head towards you and get that fish coming out. And once you get that fish coming out of that cover, that structure, those boat docks, all of those different obstacles that we got to get them out of, you know, and get them out of there and get them, you know, open into that open water, the rod really doesn't matter as much. At that point, you're just fighting the fish and trying to get the fish into the boat. But really the power and the action of the rod comes into play when we're trying to turn those fish's head, clear all those obstacles and get them out of there. Now, speaking of clearing the obstacles, another big thing that we need to talk about is the line that I use. So I flip and pitch and skip almost exclusively on fluorocarbon, especially when I'm flipping and pitching and skipping, specifically what we're talking about in today's video, around things like boat docks. You're looking for abrasion resistance more than you're looking for zero stretch. The reason that I don't use braid is because with braid digs in. So if I'm flipping around boat docks with wooden dock posts, or I'm flipping around boat docks that have, you know, different kinds of wooden things, or even when I'm flipping around boat docks that have metal, The metal we'll talk about here in just a minute. But the wood in particular, all braid is going to do to that wood is do exactly what the job of braid is. It's going to cut in. And so you can hit a fish with braid around a wooden boat dock post. And what you'll do is actually cut that braid into that wood. You'll reel that fish up to that boat dock post that is made out of wood, and then the edge of that piece of wood, or even if it's round, will act like a fulcrum point, and it will just essentially pop that jig right out of that fish's face. Whereas with fluorocarbon, it's going to allow you to hit that fish. It's not going to dig in, and you're going to be able to bring that fish around that boat dock post without that digging in point and cutting into that wood. Now, when it comes to metal, on the other hand, the reason that I don't like to use braid and I use fluorocarbon is because of the abrasion resistance of fluorocarbon. Just like with any fabric, because braid is a form of fabric, when you rub it up against something metal, you're either going to fray it or you're going to cut it. And so with fluorocarbon, the abrasion resistance of fluorocarbon allows you to rub that line against hard surfaces like rocks and metal and different things like that. And it allows you to get over those things and through those things without actually cutting or breaking this line. Whereas with braid, it would just cut it right off. Realistically, when we talk about braid fishing, I only use it in topwater scenarios and in fishing around grass, because with grass, again, just like with mower blades, we want to cut that grass and we want to get that grass out of our way and create a path out for those fish. That's where we use braid. But for everything else, we're using fluorocarbon, just for the simple fact that it's not going to dig in, and then if we do touch it against metal, have to bring it over metal, it's not going to cut it. It's going to be abrasion resistant, and it's going to allow you to get that fish out of that piece of cover. And so that's why we use fluorocarbon. And then when it comes to my reel, I'm using a 9-gear ratio reel. This is a Revo SX Rocket. You can use a 7-gear ratio reel. I just think a faster gear ratio reel, it doesn't have to be specifically this high of speed. I just like these higher speed reels because it allows me that when I do hit a fish and I get them turned, I can pick up all that line, I can catch up with that line, and I can put pressure on that fish and I can get them coming out of there. And then two, sometimes you skip up under a boat dock and the bass kind of clears the boat dock by itself. It grabs that jig, and they'll especially do this when there's a lot of fish under a dock. They'll grab them and start swimming out away from that dock to get what they just ate away from those other bass. And so when that happens, being able to just pick that line up and then just hit that fish as hard as you can and drive that big jig hook into their face can be really, really important for putting bass into the boat. And then the last thing I want to talk about is how I choose jig colors for skipping jigs and skipping boat docks with a jig this time of year, and kind of what I'm looking for. For the most part, I'm going to be using some sort of natural and or bluegill style color. The reason that I'm doing that is because I'm wanting to look like a bluegill. And, in the book, Knowing Bass, one of the things it talks about is that, oftentimes anglers say that it mimics or does a really good job of like matching the hatch. And realistically, that is kind of a moot point to bass, because bass don't know it doesn't matter to a bass if something looks like what it's eating, as long as it meets all the parameters to eat it. But what I have noticed this time of year is, even though that is so, another thing that the book talks about is that bass eat what they expect to be food. And so if you do a really good job of looking like what a bass expects to be food, then you're going to get those bass to bite. And so I like using kind of, a green pumpkin brown. This happens to be like a brown with a little bit of chartreuse on it. And then when it comes to fishing a jig, one thing that I like to do, and this is kind of just a little, sneaky thing that a lot of people, I think, don't do, but they definitely should, is use some sort of contrasting trailer. Because again, referring back to the book Knowing Bass, one of the things that the book talks about is how bass eat things that contrast the environment around them as well as contrast themselves more often than they eat things that are one uniform color. And that's because a bass's eye works in a way that contrasting things really gets their attention and helps them to really eat it. And so as you guys can see, with this jig, not only does the skirt contrast itself, we got some chartreuse with some brown in there, and you guys can see those are two very contrasting colors, but then I'm also throwing that little blueberry moonshine trailer on the back. So I've got a blue trailer on a green pumpkin jig, and so that does a really good job of contrasting itself, as well as doing a really good job of looking like a bluegill. Because if you look at a bluegill has a lot of different contrasting colors all around it, and oftentimes they're going to have a little bit of green, a little bit of chartreuse, a little bit of brown, a little bit of blue. And so picking your jig trailer really oftentimes has to do with the forage that you're fishing around. But then two, the fact that bluegills and other panfish style fish this time of year are pretty much the food source and then the enemy of bass. You know, when you're talking about pre-spawn, that is the food source for a lot of bass. And then as we go spawn and post-spawn, that is the enemy of bass. And so bass are going to react to that thing with a lot of hate in their heart, but they'll also react to that thing with a lot of hunger in their heart as well, because they've fattened up, ate a lot, getting ready to spawn. They spawn and just don't really eat a lot or actively feed. And as they go into the post-spawn, they go into this more aggressive, guarding nature that is kind of mixed with, hey, I need to eat, I need to fill my belly because I've expended all this energy making babies. Now it's time to feed. And the first thing that they're going to eat as they hang out around those boat docks and as they kind of just live under those boat docks is going to be something like a bluegill. And again, one of the most effective tools, the effective ways to get to them is to skip a jig up under a dock that looks like a bluegill and get some really big bites. But that is the number one jig that I think that you need to have tied on this time of year. And if you want to check them out, make sure to go down in the description or the pinned comment. I'll make sure to link everything that I talked about in today's video down there so you guys can check it out. And if you really enjoyed this video and you want some more jig fishing tips, click this video, it's popping up right here.